Study 9, The Divided Kingdom, the North.
Idolatry was the great problem in the monarchy period. We saw it in our last study with Solomon, who, persuaded by his wives, began to not only worship the Lord Jehovah, but began to worship these various other deities, so that he developed a very bad theology, which was the Lord Jehovah is great, but there are other gods as well. When we venture into the period of time now where Solomon has died, and now we have his son Rehoboam becoming king, idolatry rears its ugly head in a massive way, and the course of Old Testament history is changed for the next 2 centuries because of what happens now. And so we're going to be starting our study by focusing on 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12. But before we get there, just a brief reminder of where we have been and where we are going. We have seen that as you read the Old Testament, particularly the 11 foundational books, you find that really the Old Testament divides naturally into 4 periods of time. The period of formation, the longest period of time, is when God is forming the nation, and we saw how the text takes us through people, law, and land. And then when that period is over, the nation of Israel is a legitimate nation now. God is going to be their king. They're not going to have a king or prime minister or president or something of that nature. God will be their king. And the people involved will be the priests and later on emergency people to deliver them from their problems, the judges. This did not go well, because the people simply refused to obey the Constitution, Israel's law code. And so drastically and tragically, the book ends with the statement that every man did what was right in his own eyes, and that always breeds chaos in any culture and in any nation. We now come to the monarchy period, and we looked in our last study at the united monarchy, where you have 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. But we are now at that moment in time which is critical in Old Testament history, the division of the kingdom because of the idolatry of King Solomon. And so we saw that Solomon's sin, which was this matter of going after other gods, was that which was so egregious that God said, we're dealing with this. And keep in mind something, and that is that the law code, how did the law code begin? It began with, you're not to have any other gods before me. You're not to make graven images. This is how God started out. This is a big deal. Idolatry, which is an affection and loyalty to anybody or anything besides the true God, fits into idolatry. So even we who are believers, we are warned in the New Testament about idolatry, because you and I can become idolatrous. In fact, the Apostle John, in writing to some of his wonderful converts, says to them in 1 John chapter 5, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." Well, why would he say that? Because you and I have this tendency to put God on the periphery of life and to focus our time, affections, loyalties on other things and other people. The Apostle Paul dealt with the same thing, and when he was talking to the believers at Corinth, he says, watch out for idolatry. Now, he's not talking to some pagans running around loose. He's talking to people who are believers in Christ, a part of the church. Watch idolatry. And why does he say that? He says, look, you got to understand something. God seems to be rather sensitive about this matter of idolatry and you looking after and going after other gods. And if you do, if that's your choice, it's never going to work out well for you, because God is going to step in because He knows idolatry is not good for you. When you don't have a right relationship with Him, life is never going to go well. And so idolatry is really a big deal. You see, when you and I think of idolatry, we think of maybe going out into our backyard and setting up a totem pole and sacrificing the neighbor's cat or something there and bowing down before this totem pole or some idol. Well, probably that's not our problem. But what is our problem is that our affections and loyalties and focus of life are not on the Lord God. He's on the periphery of life. We don't deny He exists. He's on the periphery, though. In fact, did you know that when the Bible talks about being ungodly, it's not talking about someone being atheistic or even agnostic. We're glad to have God around, especially when we get into some trouble. Give Him a ring and hey, we need help. But He's really out on the periphery of life. And that's not good for us. Remember back in the Garden of Eden, God created us for a relationship with Himself. Solomon said it in his wiser moments and wiser times. Eternity is in the heart. It's been placed into the heart of people. There's a God consciousness there. And when that's not right, nothing else is really right as well. So this is a big deal that we are now facing in the kingdom period. So when we look at this moment in time, which this is where we're perched, and we're looking at 1 Kings chapter 12. So if you do have your Bibles, I want you to turn there and to look through this section with me. 1 Kings chapter 12. Now again, this is one of those places in Scripture that you need to underline in your thinking, because this is not just any old chapter. This is a chapter which charts the course now for the rest of the Old Testament. Then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Now Shechem just happens to be a little bit north of Jerusalem, and they've decided that that's where the coronation for Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, is going to take place. So verse 2 introduces us to another man. It came about when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, that he was living in Egypt, for he was yet in Egypt, where he fled from the presence of King Solomon. And if you remember last time, the reason why he fled from King Solomon is he tried to assassinate him, which is usually brings about a negative response from somebody. They say, the people there at Shechem, as they gather to make Rehoboam the king, "Your father," referring to Solomon, "made our yoke hard." And what they mean by that is this guy is taxing us to death. And Solomon, for being as wise as he was, he really did some foolish things. He taxed heavily all the tribes of Israel except his own, Judah. And he found something that politicians have found, and that is, the more you tax people, the more money you have to play with, the more things you can do, places you can go, and all of this. And what they're saying is, look, he really has laid it on us. If you will relieve the tax burden, we will serve you. We will gladly have you as king. So before we anoint you as king, you've got to tell us that you're going to lift some of this tax load. Well, Rehoboam, he thinks about all this, and he has this choice to make. And the choice is this: am I going to acquiesce to what the people ask for and relieve the tax load a little bit, or not? Well, he went to his counselors, wise elderly men, and they said to him, what the people are asking is legitimate. And if you will do that, they're going to like you, and they're going to embrace you as their king. Which, by the way, was wise counsel. But then he went to another group, his college roommates, and he said, bro, what are we going to do about this? And they said, you gotta tell them who's boss from day one. You back off now, and you're going to be retreating for the rest of your reign. No, no, no. You got to tell him you ain't seen nothing yet. You think dear old Dad was tough? Just watch me. You think your tax load was heavy with Dad? Just watch me. And so he came back, and the king, according to verse 13, answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him. Rehoboam was not too bright. He didn't have great people skills. In fact, Solomon sort of hinted at the fact that Rehoboam was a foolish man. He does that in the book of Ecclesiastes. Well, what happens, of course, is that the people say, get out of here and go home. We are not going to allow you to be our king. And instead, they now bring in this fellow Jeroboam, who attempted to assassinate Solomon sometime earlier. Well, Rehoboam figures that we'll keep these people in line by force. And so he gets a large army together. And God sends a prophet to him and says, you don't go fight with your brothers. Don't do it. And that was the only really smart thing that Rehoboam ever did. He actually listened to a prophet of God, and he called off the civil war. Well, what we have now is a divided kingdom. Jeroboam now becomes the king of the north. I want you to look down at verse 25. I should point out that Jeroboam had been given quite an offer by God, and that is, Jeroboam, if you will follow me, I will prosper you, and I will allow your lineage to go on and on and on. Jeroboam opted out of that offer. But here's the point now. In verse 25, then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And what he's doing now, he has a strategic problem. Where's the capital? The capital is Jerusalem. Well, if you're going to start a new kingdom, you've got to get a capital. And so he tried one place, and that didn't seem to work out, so he tried another. But in verse 26, he says this, Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, in other words, where's Jerusalem? Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom. It's right at the border, but it is in the southern kingdom. And these people are all allegedly worshipers of the Lord Jehovah. So he's figuring this, if I allow the people to continue to go and worship at Jerusalem, they're going to be putting two and two together pretty soon and wondering, after a few years, why in the world are we a divided kingdom? Verse 27, this people go up to offer sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me, and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So what does he do? He consulted, didn't say with whom, but he consulted probably his cabinet and made 2 golden calves. And he said to them, and notice what he says, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. First of all, we want to make your religion a little easier to work with. Jerusalem's a long way away. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set one of these golden calves at Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. So we now have Jeroboam making a very strategic move. And the move has to do with the golden calves. So we ask the question, why did Jeroboam do it? I mean, this is radical stuff here, to change your religion in midstream. But he came to the conclusion that I cannot maintain a political division Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and be united religiously or spiritually. So we've got to make a difference in religion as well, but we got to be careful about what we do. And so, what does he say? He says, these are your gods who brought you up out of Egypt. He is not saying, we've done Jehovah for a while. Hey, let's try the Moabite god of Molech, okay? Let's do that for a while. That's not going to fly. But he says, in other words, we're going to still be worshiping Jehovah. It's kind of a modified form of Jehovah worship. So here's what he is faced with. Here is, of course, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom, and this is where the temple is located. Everybody flows to Jerusalem several times a year to the great feasts. So Jeroboam thinks, we got to do something about this, including changing the location. And so he now makes 2 worship centers of golden calves. One will be at Bethel. And the idea here would be that anybody, in this area, Transjordan, the easiest place to go would be Bethel rather than Jerusalem. And for all the folks living in this part of the woods, we'll put it up at Dan. So, hey, wherever you are in the northern kingdom, it's more convenient, it is easier to go to one of our brand new worship centers. You don't need to go to Jerusalem. Now, I would point out, by the way, that when he does this, the truly righteous people, the people who are followers of the Lord in the northern kingdom, they go south. They leave everything behind and they become a part of the southern kingdom of Judah. They leave their land behind, which was a big deal, and by the thousands they come and populate the southern kingdom. And so this is a huge loss because the northern kingdom is now depleted from people who are really godly people. So the question is, why did Jeroboam do it? The answer is, he wants to make sure he can maintain that political division and not be killed. He's sort of afraid that people are going to say, hey, what in the world are we doing? Who's it? Out with Jeroboam. The family of David is the ones we're supposed to be following. And so Jeroboam did something rather dramatic. He set up these new centers of worship. He changed the priesthood so that it isn't Levites anymore. It's Freddie from the tribe of Asher, or whoever wants to be a priest can now be a priest. And you now have a problem with the calendar, so we used to celebrate Passover. We're going to change the calendar too. So he has dramatically changed a lot of things, but remember, he is still saying that this is the Lord Jehovah that we are worshiping. This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt. My guess is, we don't have a lot of information on this, but my guess is that whatever he did was spectacular because he had to rival a $20 billion temple in Jerusalem. So he's pouring a lot of time, money, and effort into these worship centers at Dan and Bethel. We can only imagine what they might have looked like. So the question is, why golden calves? Why not a bronze giraffe, or a silver camel or something of that nature? Well, first of all, these were symbols, he said, of the Lord Jehovah. This is your God that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. But secondly, not only is this now a modified form, but he's got to appeal to what happened at Mount Sinai. Now, we didn't go over this in our study, but one of the amazingly bad things that took place on Mount Sinai, or at Mount Sinai, was Aaron made a golden calf, and the people began to worship it, and that did not go well with Moses or with the Lord. But here's the reason why he selected a calf because this was a very common symbol of strength and of might in the ancient Near East. And the idea, if your God is seen as a bull, he is a strong, he is a mighty God. And so you know that all of the propaganda is issuing forth that the Lord Jehovah, we're still worshiping Him. He is a mighty God. And just to help you guys out a little bit, we're going to make it closer for you. And furthermore, we are going to have these wonderful places of worship. We are going to worship Jehovah, our mighty God. So the worship centers are set up at Dan in the north and Bethel in the south. And as we indicated, the priesthood was changed as well. It's interesting that some 21 times in the Old Testament, Jeroboam is given this title, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Because what's happening now, we have a deliberate step into idolatry. And the northern kingdom of Israel will never recover from this. For 200 years, they are going to be laboring under the golden calf. And every single king is a golden calf worshiper or worse. Now, this picture is taken in northern Israel at Tel Dan. What the Israeli archaeologists have uncovered is the place where the northern center of worship took place. And what they have done is to replicate, most likely, what the size of the altar was there, based upon the dimensions of the brazen altar, the altar of sacrifice in the temple. We believe that there are, and as here, there, and everywhere, you have places where there are for washings and that kind of thing. But most likely, my guess is that up here you had this golden calf as a form of worship. So, and this is, by the way, about a mile from the Lebanese border today. But this is a fascinating thing to observe, because here is, in 21st century, here is Old Testament history coming to light and coming to life. And so it was here. And of course, what we have is simply the bare bones of what they have uncovered. But you can imagine what the lavish structure it must have been like. So this is the northern place, Dan, where the golden calves were set up. So what I want to do, if we can, is to, for both the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom, is to walk through the kings to remember. I want to do this because this section of the Old Testament is basically unknown to most people. They just really don't know about the monarchy period. And yet it is so crucial because so much of the Old Testament is related to it. So the best thing I've been able to do, I think, is to look at the kings of the northern kingdom. Now keep in mind that the northern kingdom will last for a little over 2 centuries. And during that period of time, you will have 20 kings who reign. There are 5 kings who we select out of those 20 to say, hey, you know what? It would be good if you would know who these guys are. The rest of them were losers anyway, and they really didn't make that much of an impact. They were men who were the politicians of their day. They could care less about anybody except themselves, and they were golden calf worshipers or worse. So Jeroboam the first would be, I would say, the first king that we should remember. Jeroboam the first came to the throne in 931, the year that Solomon died, and he, of course, is the one who set Israel on its course of idolatry, willfully choosing to set up an idolatrous worship system. And once again, Jeroboam could have followed the Lord. The Lord had made a promise to him that if he would follow the Lord, that he would prosper him and continue his reign, and he chose not to do that. A political expediency. I don't want to get killed, whatever. So he starts golden calf worship, which is if you can imagine, the worship of the Lord is here, true worship of the Lord. He's taken a huge step down with this modified form of Jehovah worship. And then we come to everybody's all-time dynamic duo, Ahab and Jezebel. Not too many people call their children Jezebel. Have you ever wondered why? She was one evil woman. She was a follower of Baal. She was a Phoenician woman. She wasn't an Israelite. And she was probably the head of her Baal Youth Fellowship and all of this kind of thing. And when she marries Ahab, she brings Baal with her. And the northern kingdom now, it was bad enough that they are worshiping the golden calf. Now they are taking a step down into the corrupt Baal worship. Now, again, you go back to the time of the conquest of the land. They were to wipe out the Canaanites because they were Baal worshipers. And Baal worshipers it was a fertility cult. And they were as degenerate as you can possibly imagine. You think of it, the most degenerate situation, these guys were doing it. And that's what Ahab and Jezebel now bring to the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom is in a very bad way right now. Then God raises up the prophet Elisha. And Elisha is now going to deal with the situation in the north. And he has one of his Bible college students go up and anoint a guy by the name of Jehu. Jehu is one of the 5-star generals of the northern army. And we need a little coup here. We need to get rid of Ahab and Jezebel. And so Jehu is anointed privately as king by none other the direction of Elisha. And so what Jehu did was to remove Baalism out of the land. The Lord said to him, I want you to eliminate Ahab's household. You will become the next king, and I want you to eliminate Baal worship. Well, Jehu is kind of keen on the idea of maybe having a little coup here and becoming king himself. And so he does it. He goes off and finds King Ahab, and he kills Ahab's son. All the sons of Ahab are now put to death. By the way, there were 70 sons. Go figure on that one. But he eliminates the entire family of Ahab, except for Jezebel. He's got to go find Jezebel. So he goes to another town where Jezebel is located. Jezebel's one tough cookie, and she sees Jehu down there. She knows what he's done, that he's wiped out the family, and she, you traitor! Jehu looks up. She's up on the second floor. He looks up and he says, hey, anybody up there on my side? A couple guys pop out. We are. Throw her down. But you know what's kind of cool about Jezebel? Before all this, the text says she's putting her makeup on. I mean, and she's going out in style. So anyway, they launch Jezebel out the window, and he drives over her with his chariot, does a few wheelies on her, and goes to the local deli and has a sandwich. And while he's in there, he says, you know, she was a king's daughter, we should bury her. And they go out to find the body, and the dogs have already gotten a hold of her, which is one of the predictions of what would happen to this woman. So here you have Jehu. What has he done? Well, he's brought Israel from Baalism back up to a polluted form of Jehovah worship. The Lord said, I want you to bring them back up here. He said, I think I'll go this far. And so God blessed a little bit Jehu by giving him 4 descendants and the longest dynasty in the northern kingdom. By the way, in the northern kingdom, there were 9 dynasties, 9 ruling families. How many were in the southern kingdom? 1, the family of David. Whenever you read that statistic, 9 dynasties, think bloodletting. Because it wasn't like we in America, we elect a new president, and for the most part, it's pretty calm and seamless. Not back then. You changed kings' families. You killed everybody. Family members, friends, whoever could possibly be a rival to your throne. So Jehu goes down in history as a guy who at least did a little bit of good, though he himself remained a calf worshiper. Then there was a guy, Jeroboam II. And I always hesitate to call him the best king of the north because he was an idolater. He was a worshiper of the golden calves. But if you were to pick any time to live in the north, it's this guy's reign. Time of peace, prosperity came. And in order to understand why that's the case, you go to the prophets who were living at that time. Amos and Hosea, the 2 prophets God sent to the northern kingdom. You see, the value of knowing when the prophets ministered, you slot them into the historical setting. All of a sudden, their messages take on new meaning, new light. We know who they were talking to and why they were saying what they were saying. So this is one of the great values in knowing something of the kings in the monarchy period and what was going on, because when you start reading this great bulk of literature, the prophets, you have an idea then of the setting historically, militarily, financially, spiritually, of what's going on. And Amos and Hosea were the 2 kings that God raised, prophets that God raised up during this time. There was actually a 3rd guy who was a prophet to the northern kingdom, one of the writing prophets. His name was Jonah. However, Jonah, we don't know about his ministry in the northern kingdom because God sent him on a short-term missions trip, you remember, to Nineveh, which of course didn't go so well at first. But the point is that what God did in the reign of Jeroboam II was to raise up 3 of the writing prophets. And these men had an influence in the northern kingdom. And part of the reason why the kingdom was in better shape was that these men were having an influence there. Well, there is a 5th king named Hoshea, and the only reason why he is included here is that he was the one who is not as evil as the rest. So I had to include him for that reason. But he is the last king of the northern kingdom, and he is the one who watches the troops of Assyria come sweeping down and taking the northern kingdom captive in the year 721. So the interesting thing, though, is that the northern kingdom, that God sent all kinds of prophets to them. And one of the things that we learn from this is that, God delights in saving people. He prefers that to judgment. In fact, the Scriptures say that judgment is the strange work of God. He doesn't like to judge people. He wants to save people. He wants to bring them back to Himself. And at this point, I think it's important that I would mention to you that, and I hear this all the time, and it's usually from people who I think have very little understanding of the Old Testament. But the accusation is that the God of the Old Testament is sort of a bully. He has a hair-trigger temper. He can hardly wait to knock you into next Tuesday. If you only step out of line, he's just waiting for you to step out of line. So bam, into next Tuesday you go. The great self-revelation of God is found in Exodus chapter 34, when Moses met God on the mountain. And God, he said, I want to know what you're like. And God said, I am the Lord God. I am slow to anger. I am full of compassion, and I am full of loyal love. You think of your own life. I think of my own life. If God was a God who loved judgment, I would not be here today, and I would, if I was here today, which I am, you would not be here today. The point is that God works with us and delights to bring us to Himself. I have oftentimes heard people compare the Lord Jehovah of the Old Testament with Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus is really a nice guy. Jehovah, not so much. And as Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Lord Jehovah. They are the identical character. They delight in saving people. That's what God wants to do. I oftentimes wonder, in my own stupidity, why, Lord, don't you deal with that person? They're thumbing their nose at you. They're walking arrogantly. There is a kind of degraded lifestyle they're living. Why don't you do something about it? You know that politician, Lord, that has lied and deceived and done this? How long are you going to put up with that? And He would come back and say, I am slow to anger. I am full of loving kindness. I do not have a hair-trigger temper. And so we see in the days of Noah, God said to Noah, I'm giving man 120 years. And Peter tells us that Noah was not only, and by the way, Noah probably employed a large group of builders. He didn't do that by himself. But Peter tells us that he preached. People would come out, they'd come out in busloads probably, to look at this thing that's being built. And he would explain, hey, look, God is going to bring a flood upon the earth. What's a flood anyway? And he says, now look, God has made provision for you. You want to be safe from this coming flood? Come on board, you're welcome. 0 people interest. And so Jesus used that as an example, saying, hey, look, judgment delayed is not judgment denied. And so God gave them 120 years. Look at our friends here in the northern kingdom. From 931 to 721, mathematical wizards, that's 210 years. I think if I was the Lord, I would have slapped Jeroboam the first on the side of the head and knocked him into Assyria or someplace, for doing that. God put up with them, and He sent prophet after prophet after prophet to His people. And so throughout the Scriptures, you see this tremendous grace and patience of God towards people. And, I think of most of us, we're just very grateful that God was that way. We can only imagine if He stepped in and nailed us the first time we did something really evil or stupid or whatever. So the God of the Old Testament is a gracious God, delighting in saving people, but eventually, as He told Moses, look, I'm reaching out to you, but you know what? If you won't come to me, because I am a holy God, I will step in and deliver judgment to you. And so that was the situation in the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom, according to 2 Kings chapter 17, went into captivity for one fundamental reason. They had built places for idolatry. They served idols. They rejected His statutes and His covenant, which He made with their fathers. See, they couldn't claim ignorance because they had a very clearly laid out constitution as to what was required of them. And so instead of that, they served Baal. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from His sight. None was left except the tribe of Judah. And so in case somebody hasn't figured it out yet, 2 Kings 17 explains to us that they went into captivity because of the sin of idolatry. They had turned from the Lord their God. Now, I try to, at this point, sort of a parenthetical point, because somewhere along the line, I want to explain something about the role of the prophets in Israel. In Israel, there were 3 main or basic positions or offices. The first one was the office of priest, and that was established, if you remember, down at Mount Sinai. So God had said that it'll be the tribe of Levi, okay? If you're a Levite, your job in life is going to be worship, leading people in worship and helping out at the tabernacle and then later on the temple. You guys are set apart for that, okay? Tribe of Levi. So, what happens if the priesthood goes bad? Well, they become corrupt because they did. Does God at that point say, "Oy vey, what have I done? Asher, I think I'll try the tribe of Asher now and make them the priestly tribe, or maybe we'll try Benjamin later on." No, God made a commitment down at Mount Sinai that the tribe of Levi would be the priestly tribe. Okay, we're stuck with it now. The second major office would be that of the king. And when we get to David, we have the same phenomenon. And that is that it will be the line of David that will be the kingly line. So what happens if kings go bad? And they did. We're stuck with the line of David. The family of David is the kingly family. So, you can't say, well, I think we'll get the family of Elihu now and make him the king. God made this commitment as an everlasting commitment. It is the family of David. So the first two offices, you see, if they go bad, there's no recourse because God has made a commitment to that particular office, or tribe or family. Not so with the prophet. The prophets were individually selected so that in reality, you don't have any bad prophets. It's a phenomenon that when you're reading the Old Testament, you say, wow, these guys seem to be the good guys, and you got bad kings and bad priests and all that, but the prophets that's because God said, you're a prophet. I'm going to raise you up. So that's why they now become significant. So let's look at it this way. We have these periods that we've been looking at. Period of formation, the period of the theocracy, and then the period of the monarchy. Now, here's what we see. The prophetic office, when did the first prophet come along? Well, we know from Jeremiah that the first prophet was Moses. And so during the time of formation, you have God's very first prophet. This didn't mean that God never spoke to other people like Adam and Noah and so on, but someone who would function as the mouthpiece of God, which is what the Hebrew word nabi means. He is the mouth of God. He's not the brain. He's not originating the message. He's simply communicating the message. So the first one was Moses. And then you get into the theocracy period, and as we saw in 1 Samuel, there's almost no word from God during this time. But when we hit the monarchy period, this is where the office of prophet becomes significant, because now we're dealing with kings who are supposed to be ruling according to the Constitution. See, one of the jobs of the prophets, when we think of a prophet, we usually think of a guy who prophesies, foretells the future. And they did do that. But you know what some of their main job was? They were to be counselors to the king, and they were to call the king back to the Constitution. The law code. O king, you're supposed to be adhering to the law code. And you find that a number of kings, the people who were of most significance in their kingdom were the prophets. So Isaiah, for example, was a man a prophet of God who had great influence over 4 different kings. So they had a very important and significant role in the monarchy period. And that's why, as we study the monarchy period, we need to have some sort of a grip on it, because this is where so much of the Old Testament scriptures are to be found. Well, I can't believe it, but the time has evaporated. When you're having fun, it does go by quickly. But we will pick up at this point and be looking at the southern kingdom and then the period of captivity in our next study.